Black Waitress says to the CEO. Hi sir, my mother has a ring just like yours. But what happened next is shocking. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany tables of Le Bernardin, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. At table 12, Marcus Whitmore adjusted his Armani cuffs and glanced at his Patek Philippe watch. The merger papers scattered before him represented 18 months of ruthless negotiations, a deal worth $2.8 billion that would cement his position as the youngest Fortune 500 CEO in America. At 38, Marcus commanded respect in every room he entered. His steel-gray eyes had stared down hostile boardrooms, his sharp jawline had graced the covers of Forbes and Business Week, and his custom Italian suits spoke a language of power that needed no translation. Tonight's dinner with the Japanese investors was merely a formality. The signatures were as good as ink on paper. Your usual Dom Perignon, Mr. Whitmore? The sommelier approached with practiced deference. Make it the 96. We're celebrating tonight. Marcus's smile held the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. As the sommelier retreated, a young woman appeared at his table. She couldn't have been more than 25, her dark skin glowing under the warm restaurant lighting. Her movements were graceful despite the weight of the heavy water pitcher she carried. There was something about her presence, a quiet dignity that seemed oddly out of place in a world where most people either cowered before him or schemed to use him. Good evening, sir. I'm Zara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Her voice carried a slight southern lilt, warm like honey. Can I start you with some still or sparkling water? Still is fine. Marcus barely looked up from his documents, his attention focused on the acquisition details that would make him richer by morning. Zara moved with practiced efficiency, filling his crystal glass without making a sound. But as she set the pitcher down, her eyes caught something that made her pause. On Marcus's right hand, catching the light from the chandelier above, sat a ring unlike anything she'd seen in this restaurant full of expensive jewelry. It wasn't the size of the diamond that caught her attention, though the emerald-cut stone was easily 3 carats. It wasn't even the intricate platinum setting with its delicate filigree work. It was something else entirely. Something that made her heart skip a beat and her breath catch in her throat. Excuse me, sir, she said, her voice softer now, tinged with curiosity. That's a beautiful ring you're wearing. Marcus glanced up, mildly annoyed at the interruption. His eyes swept over her briefly, taking in the standard black uniform, the simple gold cross at her throat, the way she held herself with quiet composure. Just another waitress making small talk, probably fishing for a bigger tip. Thank you, he replied curtly, turning back to his papers. But Zara didn't move away. Instead, she stood there for a moment longer, studying the ring with an intensity that finally forced Marcus to look up again. There was something in her expression, a mix of wonder and recognition that he couldn't quite place. I'm sorry if this sounds strange, she continued, but my mother has a ring just like yours. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The merger documents in his hands suddenly felt weightless. The bustling sounds of the restaurant, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of conversations, the soft jazz playing in the background, all faded into absolute silence. His steel-gray eyes, which had never betrayed weakness in a boardroom, widened with something that looked dangerously close to fear. The confident smile that had charmed investors and intimidated competitors vanished completely, replaced by an expression of raw shock. What did you say? His voice came out rougher than intended, barely above a whisper. Zara noticed the change immediately. The powerful man who had been dismissing her moments before now looked like he'd seen a ghost. His knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the table, and she could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. I said my mother has a ring just like yours, she repeated, her own voice growing uncertain. The same design, the same stone. I've never seen anything like it before except... She trailed off, watching as Marcus's face went through a series of expressions, shock, recognition, and something that looked like guilt. He was staring at the ring on his own finger, as if he'd forgotten it was there, as if it had suddenly become a weight too heavy to bear. 23 years. 23 years since he'd last thought about that ring and what it represented. 23 years since he'd made a promise he'd never kept. 23 years since he turned his back on the woman who had saved his life when no one else would even look his way. "Your mother," he said slowly, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "What's her name?" "Ruby. Ruby Johnson." Zara's eyes searched his face, trying to understand why her simple observation had caused such a dramatic reaction. "Sir, are you all right? You look like you've seen it." "Ruby Johnson." Marcus repeated the name like a prayer, like a curse, like a debt he'd never paid. His hand moved unconsciously to the ring, twisting it around his finger, a nervous habit he'd developed years ago whenever the weight of his choices became too heavy to bear. The Japanese investors would arrive in 20 minutes. The merger papers still needed his signature. His driver was waiting outside in a $200,000 Mercedes. His penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park, and his private jet was fueled and ready for tomorrow's flight to London. But in this moment, surrounded by all the trappings of his success, Marcus Whitmore felt smaller than he had in decades. Because a young waitress with kind eyes and a familiar smile had just shattered the carefully constructed wall he built around his past. "Sir?" Zara's voice brought him back to the present. "Do you know my mother?" Marcus looked up at her, really looked at her for the first time. And there, in the curve of her smile and the warmth of her eyes, he saw echoes of a woman who had risked everything for a stranger. A woman who had asked for nothing in return except a promise. A promise he had broken the moment success came calling. He started, then stopped. How do you tell someone that you owe your entire life to their mother? How do you explain that every success, every achievement, every dollar in your bank account exists because of a kindness you repaid with abandonment? The restaurant continued to buzz around them, but at table 12, time had stopped. A powerful CEO sat frozen in his chair, and a young waitress stood waiting for an answer that would change both of their lives forever. Marcus's phone buzzed on the table. The Japanese investors, no doubt, confirming their arrival. But he couldn't bring himself to look at it. All he could see was Ruby's face from 23 years ago, her dark eyes filled with determination as she pressed the ring into his palm and made him promise to remember her kindness. "Yes," he whispered finally, the word catching in his throat. "Yes, I knew your mother. A long time ago." And with those words, the carefully ordered world of Marcus Whitmore began to crumble, one memory at a time. The words hung in the air between them, and suddenly Marcus wasn't sitting in Le Bernardin anymore. The crystal chandeliers dissolved, the mahogany tables faded, and the soft jazz was replaced by the harsh sounds of a different world, a world he tried desperately to forget. Detroit, 1999. Winter. 23-year-old Marcus had been a different man then, hungry, desperate, and drowning in debts that would have killed a weaker person. He dropped out of Harvard Business School in his final semester, not because he couldn't handle the work, but because his gambling addiction had consumed everything. His trust fund, his parents' money, even the loans he'd taken from people who didn't accept late payments gracefully. He'd fled to Detroit with nothing but a stolen car and a business plan that existed only in his imagination. The plan was simple: create a tech startup, find investors, and get rich quick. What he found instead was a city that chewed up dreamers like him and spit out their bones. The memory that haunted him most took place on a February night when the snow was falling so hard it felt like the world was ending. He'd been staying in a roach-infested motel on 8 Mile, surviving on convenience store coffee and stolen donuts. That night, 3 men had cornered him in the parking lot. "You Marcus Whitmore?" The leader, a mountain of a man with tattoos covering his neck, had asked the question like he already knew the answer. Marcus's stomach had dropped. Vincent Caruso's men. The loan shark he'd borrowed $50,000 from in Boston had found him. "You got our money?" The second man cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing off the brick walls like gunshots. Marcus had stuttered, lied, begged. He promised them everything: money he didn't have, connections that didn't exist, a future that seemed impossible. But Vincent's men weren't interested in promises. They were interested in sending a message. The first punch had shattered 2 ribs. The second had split his lip open like a overripe fruit. By the time they threw him against the concrete wall, Marcus was certain he was going to die in that parking lot, another nameless victim of his own stupidity. That's when she appeared. Ruby Johnson had been working the night shift at the diner across the street. She was 42 years old, a single mother who cleaned tables and served coffee to make ends meet. She had every reason to mind her own business, to pretend she didn't see what was happening in that dark parking lot. Instead, she'd grabbed the baseball bat from behind the diner's counter and walked straight into hell. "Y'all need to leave that boy alone." Her voice had cut through the winter air like a blade, calm and steady despite the odds stacked against her. The men had laughed. 3 professional leg breakers against a middle-aged waitress with a Louisville slugger? It should have been a joke. But Ruby Johnson wasn't laughing. And she wasn't backing down. "This ain't your business, lady," the leader had growled. "It became my business when you brought it to my neighborhood," she'd replied, raising the bat with practiced ease. "Now you got 2 choices. You can walk away, or you can explain to your boss why you let a woman with a baseball bat make you look like fools." What happened next still amazed Marcus 23 years later. Ruby hadn't just stood up to them, she'd outsmarted them. She'd called out to the diner, loud enough for the whole street to hear, telling her cousins inside to call the police and start recording with their phones. She'd mentioned specific names, specific license plates, specific details that made it clear she wasn't just some random Good Samaritan. She knew how their world worked. The men had looked at each other, confusion replacing confidence. This wasn't some helpless witness they could intimidate. This was someone who understood the rules of the game they were playing. "You got 1 minute to get in that car and drive away," Ruby had said, never lowering the bat. "Or tomorrow morning, everyone's gonna know that Vincent Caruso's boys got chased off by a grandma with a piece of wood." They'd left. Actually turned around and walked away, muttering curses and promises of what would happen if they ever saw Marcus again. But Ruby wasn't done. She'd helped Marcus to his feet, driven him to a hospital where she paid for his treatment with money she clearly couldn't afford to lose, and then, in the moment that changed everything, she'd brought him back to her small apartment. For 3 weeks, Ruby Johnson had hidden him, fed him, and nursed him back to health. She'd given him her couch, shared her food, and listened to his wild stories about business plans and dreams of success. She'd never asked for anything in return except that he promised to remember her kindness when he made it big. "When you're rich and famous," she'd said with a smile that lit up her whole face, "don't forget about the people who helped you get there." On his last night in Detroit, she'd given him the ring. Her grandmother's ring, she'd explained, passed down through 3 generations. The only valuable thing she owned, and she was giving it to a stranger. "Consider it a loan," she'd said, pressing it into his palm. "When you make your first $1,000,000, you come back and return it. That way, I'll know you kept your promise." Marcus had worn that ring every day since. Through his first successful startup, through his second and third companies, through every merger and acquisition that had built his empire. It had become his good luck charm, his reminder of how far he'd come. But now, looking at Zara's curious face, he realized it had become something else entirely, evidence of the promise he'd never kept. The merger papers on the table seemed meaningless now. All his success, built on the foundation of a kindness he'd repaid with silence. Marcus blinked, the memories releasing their grip as the sounds of the restaurant rushed back, silverware clinking, conversations humming, his phone still buzzing insistently on the table. But he couldn't focus on any of it. All he could see was Zara standing there, her dark eyes filled with the same warmth he remembered in her mother's face. "Sir?" Zara's voice was gentle but persistent. "You've been quiet for almost 5 minutes. Are you sure you're okay?" 5 minutes. Had it really been that long? Marcus looked down at his hands and realized they were shaking slightly. The powerful CEO who had never shown weakness was coming apart at the seams, and he couldn't stop it. "Your mother," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Ruby Johnson. Tell me about her." Zara shifted the water pitcher to her other hand, clearly sensing that this conversation had moved beyond normal restaurant small talk. Something in Marcus's tone, urgent, almost desperate, made her forget about her other tables. "Why do you want to know?" she asked, studying his face intently. "I mean, you said you knew her a long time ago, but the way you're looking at me, it's like you've seen a ghost." Marcus almost laughed at how accurate that description was. He had seen a ghost, the ghost of his own conscience, buried under 23 years of success and willful forgetting. "Please," he said, and the word came out like a prayer. "Just tell me about her. How is she?" The concern in his voice was so genuine that Zara found herself pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down, despite every rule about fraternizing with customers. She's struggling," Zara said honestly. "Has been for years. She works 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, serving breakfast at a diner on weekends, and doing laundry for a hotel downtown. She's 65 years old and should be retired, but—" She trailed off, and Marcus felt his chest tighten with guilt. "But what?" "But she can't afford to stop working. We live in a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens. I give her every penny I make here, but it's never enough. Her arthritis is getting worse, her back is shot from all those years of physical labor, and she still pushes herself because she says she has to take care of me." Each word was like a knife twisting in Marcus's heart. While he'd been building his empire, buying penthouses and private jets, Ruby had been breaking her body just to survive. "She raised you alone?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yeah. My father left when I was 2. Mama never talked about him much, just said some men aren't built for responsibility." Zara's voice carried no bitterness, just acceptance. "She always told me that family isn't about who stays, it's about who shows up when you need them most." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Ruby had shown up for him when he needed her most, and he had repaid that kindness by disappearing completely. "That ring," Zara continued, gesturing to his hand. "She's had one just like it for as long as I can remember. She never wears it though. Keeps it in a little box by her bed. Sometimes I catch her looking at it, and she gets this sad expression on her face." "Sad how?" "Like she's remembering something that hurts. When I was little, I used to ask her about it. She'd just say it was a reminder of a promise someone made to her once." Zara leaned forward, her eyes searching his face. "You made her a promise, didn't you?" Marcus felt the weight of 23 years crashing down on him. Here was Ruby's daughter, working as a waitress in an upscale restaurant, probably making in tips what he spent on a single bottle of wine. Here was the child of the woman who had saved his life, struggling to make ends meet while he lived in luxury. "Yes," he whispered. "I made her a promise. And I broke it." Zara's eyes widened. "What kind of promise?" Marcus looked at the ring on his finger, then back at her face, so much like her mother's, but younger, hopeful in a way that Ruby's had been before life wore her down. "I promised her that when I became successful, I would remember her kindness. I promised I would come back. And you never did." It wasn't a question. Zara's voice was quiet, but there was something in her tone that made Marcus feel smaller than he had in decades. "No. I never did." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his admission hanging between them. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant dance, servers gliding between tables, wine glasses being filled, conversations flowing. But at their table, the world had stopped. "She never gave up hope," Zara said finally. "Even now, sometimes she talks about this young man she helped once. She always believed he would keep his word." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the full force of his shame. Ruby had kept faith with him for 23 years, while he had convinced himself that his past didn't matter, that his success erased his debts. "What's she like now?" he asked, needing to know but dreading the answer. "She's tired," Zara said simply. "But she's still the strongest person I know. Still helps anyone who needs it, even though she barely has enough for herself. Last week, she gave our last $20 to a homeless veteran she met at the bus stop." Of course she did. That was exactly what the Ruby he remembered would do. "And the ring?" Marcus asked. "Does she ever talk about why she keeps it?" Zara nodded slowly. She says it reminds her that kindness is never wasted, even when it seems forgotten. She says someday, the person who matters will remember, and that will make all the waiting worthwhile. Marcus felt tears threatening for the first time in years. Ruby had been waiting. All this time, through all her struggles, she had been waiting for him to remember his promise. His phone buzzed again, and this time he glanced at it. The Japanese investors were here. But for the first time in his career, Marcus Whitmore didn't care about a business deal. All he cared about was the debt he owed to a woman who had saved his life and the daughter who was looking at him with her mother's eyes, waiting to see what kind of man he really was. Marcus stared at his phone screen, watching the text message from his assistant. Mr. Yamamoto and his team have arrived. Shall I seat them at table 14? The $2.8 billion merger that had consumed his thoughts for months suddenly felt as insignificant as pocket change. I have to go, Zara said, glancing nervously toward the hostess station where her manager was scanning the dining room. But sir, if you really knew my mother, if you really made her a promise. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with 23 years of waiting and hope. What's your last name? Marcus asked suddenly. Johnson. Zara Johnson. Johnson. The same last name Ruby had given him all those years ago. No husband to change it, no new beginning to erase the past. Just Ruby Johnson, still waiting, still believing. I'll find her, Marcus said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I'll find your mother. Zara's face lit up with something that looked dangerously like hope. Really? You mean that? Marcus nodded, though his stomach was churning with anxiety. I mean it. After Zara left, Marcus sat alone with his merger documents, but the numbers on the pages might as well have been written in a foreign language. All he could think about was Ruby, 65 years old, arthritic, working 3 jobs while he lived in a penthouse that cost more per month than most people made in a year. The Japanese investors arrived with their usual punctuality, bowing respectfully as they approached his table. Mr. Yamamoto, distinguished in his perfectly tailored suit, extended his hand with a smile that represented hundreds of millions in future profits. Mr. Whitmore, it is an honor to finally meet in person. Marcus stood, shook hands, made the appropriate responses, but his heart wasn't in it. As they discussed market penetration and profit margins, his mind kept drifting to a small apartment in Queens where Ruby was probably getting ready for her night shift, her arthritic hands already aching from the day's work. The dinner passed in a blur of sake, sushi, and small talk about expansion into Asian markets. Marcus signed the papers, sealing the biggest deal of his career, but the pen felt heavy in his hand. Every signature was a reminder of how far he'd climbed while Ruby remained exactly where he'd left her. By the time the investors left, it was nearly midnight. Marcus sat alone in the empty restaurant, the staff quietly cleaning around him. The manager had offered to call his driver 3 times, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to leave. Not yet. He pulled out his phone and did something he hadn't done in 23 years. He Googled Ruby Johnson. What he found made his blood run cold. There were dozens of entries. Ruby Johnson, arrested for trespassing while trying to stop an eviction in her neighborhood. Ruby Johnson, volunteering at a homeless shelter despite working 3 jobs. Ruby Johnson, organizing food drives for families who had even less than she did. But it was the newspaper article from 6 months ago that nearly broke him. Local woman hospitalized after collapsing at work. Community rallies to support single mother who has helped countless others. Marcus read the article with growing horror. Ruby had collapsed while cleaning offices, her body finally giving out after decades of overwork. She'd spent 3 days in the hospital, days she couldn't afford, with bills she couldn't pay. The community had organized a fundraiser, but it had only covered a fraction of her medical debt. The article included a photo. Ruby at 65, her hair now silver, her face lined with years of worry and hard work. But her eyes still held that same kindness that had saved his life in a Detroit parking lot. Marcus set down his phone and looked around the restaurant where he'd just signed a deal worth more money than Ruby would see in 10 lifetimes. The crystal glasses, the gold-rimmed plates, the fresh orchids on every table, all of it suddenly felt obscene. He thought about his penthouse apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. His walk-in closet full of custom suits that cost more than Ruby's monthly rent. His garage with 3 luxury cars, each worth more than what Ruby had made in the past 5 years combined. Every success, every achievement, every dollar in his vast fortune could be traced back to that February night in Detroit when Ruby Johnson had risked her life for a stranger. Without her intervention, he would have died in that parking lot. There would be no Marcus Whitmore empire, no Fortune 500 company, no penthouse or private jets or billion-dollar mergers. Everything he had, he owed to a woman who was now breaking her body just to survive. The ring on his finger felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Ruby's grandmother's ring, given in trust and love, worn by a man who had forgotten both. Marcus pulled out his phone again and called his assistant. "Jennifer, it's Marcus. I need you to cancel all my meetings for the rest of the week." "Sir? But you have the board presentation on Thursday, and the Goldman Sachs meeting on Friday." "Cancel everything." "And Jennifer? I need you to find someone for me. Ruby Johnson lives in Queens, works multiple jobs. I need her address, her phone number, everything you can find." "Is this for a potential acquisition?" Marcus looked at the ring, thinking about promises made and broken, about debts that compound over time like interest on an unpaid loan. "No," he said quietly. "This is about paying what I owe." 3 days later, Marcus stood outside a weathered brick apartment building in Queens, his hands trembling as he clutched a small velvet box. His usual armor of custom suits had been replaced by simple jeans and a sweater, an attempt to bridge the gap between worlds that felt impossibly wide. Jennifer had been thorough in her research. Ruby lived in apartment 3B, worked the night shift at Morrison Office Complex, and had been behind on rent for the past 4 months. The medical bills from her hospitalization had pushed her deeper into debt, despite the community fundraiser. Marcus had wanted to rush over immediately, but Zara had convinced him to wait, to plan, to think about how this reunion might affect her mother. They met twice more at the restaurant, and each conversation had revealed more about Ruby's quiet strength and unshakable faith. Now, climbing the narrow stairs with their peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights, Marcus felt more nervous than he had before any board meeting or merger negotiation. This wasn't about money or power. This was about redemption, and he wasn't sure he deserved it. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding so hard he was sure the entire building could hear it. The door opened slowly, held by a security chain. Through the gap, Marcus saw a single brown eye, older now but still warm, still kind. There was a long moment of silence, and then Ruby Johnson whispered a name she hadn't spoken in 23 years. "Marcus?" The chain rattled as she fumbled to unlatch it, and then the door swung open fully. There she was, older, grayer, smaller than he remembered, but unmistakably the woman who had saved his life. She wore a faded housecoat and slippers with holes in the toes, but she carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had commanded respect in a Detroit parking lot all those years ago. "My God!" she breathed, her hand reaching out as if to confirm he was real. "Marcus Whitmore. You came back." The words broke something inside him. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as he dropped to one knee right there in her doorway, pulling the ring from his finger. "I'm sorry," he choked out, holding the ring up to her. "Ruby, I'm so sorry. I promised you I would come back, and I didn't. I promised you I would remember, and I tried to forget. I owe you everything, and I left you with nothing." Ruby stared at him for a long moment, then gently placed her weathered hands on his shoulders, helping him to his feet. "Come inside, child," she said softly. "We have a lot to talk about." Her apartment was tiny but immaculately clean, filled with thrift store furniture and family photos. Marcus noticed immediately that there were pictures of Zara everywhere: graduation from high school, her first day at various jobs, candid shots of her laughing. But it was the small wooden box on Ruby's nightstand that drew his attention. Even from across the room, He could see the corner of something that looked exactly like the ring in his hand. "You kept it," he said, gesturing toward the box. Ruby nodded, settling into a worn armchair that had been patched with duct tape. "I told you it was a loan, didn't I? I knew you'd bring it back someday." Marcus sat on the edge of her couch, still holding the ring. "But I didn't come back. Not for 23 years. You waited all this time, and I..." "Marcus." Ruby's voice was firm but gentle. "Let me tell you something about kindness. Real kindness doesn't come with conditions or expiration dates. I helped you because you needed help, not because I expected something in return. But you did expect something. You asked me to remember? And you did remember." She gestured to the ring. "You wore that ring every single day, didn't you?" Zara told me she saw it, recognized it immediately. That ring was never about coming back to pay a debt, Marcus. It was about carrying a reminder of who you were when someone believed in you. Marcus looked at her, this woman who had worked 3 jobs to survive while he built an empire, and felt ashamed of his own self-pity. "I researched you," he admitted. "After I met Zara, I looked you up. I saw the article about your hospitalization, about the medical bills. Ruby, I have billions of dollars. Billions. While you've been struggling just to pay rent." Ruby was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. When she spoke, her voice was measured. "And what exactly are you proposing to do about that, Marcus Whitmore?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and judgment. Marcus opened the velvet box he'd been carrying, revealing not just her ring, but a check, one that represented more money than Ruby had seen in her entire lifetime. "I want to give you everything I owe you," he said. "Your medical bills, a new apartment, enough money so you never have to work again. And more than that, I want to give you the recognition you deserve. I want the world to know that my success exists because of your kindness." Ruby looked at the check, then at the ring, then back at Marcus's face. Her expression was unreadable. "And what about Zara?" she asked quietly. "She'll never want for anything again. College, graduate school, her own business if she wants it. Whatever she dreams of." Ruby closed the box gently and handed it back to him. "Keep the ring," she said. "But we need to talk about the rest." Marcus stared at the velvet box in his hands, confusion replacing the relief he'd expected to feel. "I don't understand." "Ruby, this money could change everything for you. No more night shifts, no more struggling. Sit back down, Marcus." Ruby's voice carried the same quiet authority he remembered from that Detroit parking lot. "You're thinking like a businessman, not like family." Family. The word hit him like a physical blow. In all his years of success, Marcus had never had anyone he could truly call family. His parents had disowned him after the gambling debts, his ex-wife had left when the prenup proved more valuable than the marriage, and his business associates were allies of convenience, not loyalty. Ruby stood up slowly, her arthritis evident in every movement, and walked to her kitchen. She returned with 2 cups of coffee, not the expensive espresso Marcus was accustomed to, but instant coffee in mismatched mugs. Somehow, it tasted better than anything he'd had in years. 23 years ago, Ruby began, settling back into her chair. "I helped a young man who was about to get beaten to death. I didn't do it for money or recognition. I did it because it was right." Marcus nodded, unsure where she was leading. "That young man made me a promise. Not to pay me back, but to remember the kindness. To carry it forward. Now you tell me, did you keep that promise?" Marcus opened his mouth to say no, to confess his failures, but Ruby held up her hand. "Before you answer, let me tell you what I know about Marcus Whitmore. I know you employ over 15,000 people. I know your company has one of the best employee benefit packages in the country. I know you've donated millions to homeless shelters and job training programs. I know you personally funded the college education of 47 kids from Detroit, kids who reminded you of someone, maybe?" Marcus's eyes widened. He'd kept those donations anonymous, never seeking publicity or tax benefits from them. "How did you?" "Zara's been doing research too." Ruby smiled. She wanted to know what kind of man her mother had helped all those years ago. Turns out, she helped a man who spent 23 years trying to repay a debt he didn't even realize he was paying. The truth of her words settled over Marcus like a warm blanket. Every scholarship he'd funded, every homeless shelter he'd supported, every time he'd chosen compassion over profit, he'd been carrying Ruby's lesson forward, even when he didn't recognize it. "But you still struggled," Marcus protested. "While I was building my empire, you were working 3 jobs. That's not right. Life isn't about what's fair, Marcus. It's about what we do with what we're given." Ruby leaned forward, her eyes intense. "You think I've been waiting 23 years for you to come back and write me a check? Child, I've been waiting 23 years to see what kind of man you became." Marcus felt tears threatening again. "And what kind of man did I become? The kind who wears his grandmother's ring every single day for 23 years. The kind who breaks down crying when he finds out an old friend is in need. The kind who cancels billion-dollar meetings to make things right." Ruby reached out and patted his hand. "You became exactly the kind of man I hoped you would." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Ruby surprised him again. "But I will take your help," she said. "Not for me, for Zara. That girl has dreams bigger than this apartment, and she deserves the chance to chase them. And I will let you pay my medical bills, but only if you promise me something in return. Anything. I want you to create a foundation. Something that helps people the way I helped you, people who are desperate, who've made mistakes, who need a second chance. But I want Zara to run it." Marcus blinked, processing the request. "You want me to give Zara control of millions of dollars? I want you to give my daughter the chance to change lives the way her mother changed yours." Ruby's smile was radiant. "She's got my heart for helping people and your head for business. Together you two could do something beautiful." As if summoned by their conversation, they heard footsteps on the stairs outside. A key turned in the lock, and Zara walked in, stopping short when she saw Marcus sitting in her mother's living room. "Mama?" she said uncertainly. "Is everything okay?" Ruby stood up, moving to stand between Marcus and her daughter, not protectively, but like someone about to make an introduction that would change everything. "Zara, honey, I want you to meet someone properly. This is Marcus Whitmore, the young man I told you about. The one I helped in Detroit." She paused, her voice full of pride and possibility. "And Marcus, this is my daughter Zara, your new business partner." Marcus looked at Zara, seeing her mother's strength in her stance and her own unique fire in her eyes. He thought about the ring on his finger, no longer a symbol of guilt but of connection, a bridge between past kindness and future possibilities. "Ruby Johnson Foundation," he said, extending his hand to Zara. "How does that sound?" As Zara shook his hand, her smile lighting up the small apartment, Marcus finally understood what Ruby had known all along. Some debts aren't meant to be paid back, they're meant to be paid forward. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the circle comes back around to show you that the kindness you received has been growing, multiplying, creating ripples of hope in places you never imagined. The ring caught the light from Ruby's old lamp, sparkling not with guilt, but with the promise of new beginnings.